Hello, welcome to the RF Museum's podcast. I'm here today with Klisman Murati, the founder of Pangea Wire Group. And Klisman did a MA in Security Studies at University College London. And we're here to talk about European defence. And that's a really important issue right now, of course, with Britain leaving the European Union. And of course, it goes back quite a long way to sort of 1948, when Britain's working with the Western European powers in Europe to really integrate defence. And it's emerged since then. So I think if we begin, Klisman, by first of all introducing you.
Sure.
So if you can give us a few words to let us know what's your background.
Sure. Well, thank you for inviting me, Harry. It's my first time at the museum today, so it's a pleasure to get to see you again and to conduct this interview and this podcast. So in terms of myself, as you mentioned, I did an MA, I read an MSc actually in Security Studies at UCL in Security Studies, so all things to do with counterterrorism, quantitative, qualitative data, foreign policy, energy policy. So my mind has always been interested in understanding these world issues and how nation states grow and how they collapse, and how countries are strengthened by cooperation, and all the fun things in between. So that was my interest, and my master's thesis was actually in outer space security and how nations can understand sovereignty in outer space, and how we come to an understanding of what that means for future defence problems that we'll face as the years and decades go by.
Okay. And space is a really interesting issue, and we're going to get into that, because one of the big challenges Europe faces going forward, and Britain within that, is how do you cope with this emerging theatre of warfare? And we are into Space Force era with America founding an entirely new military capability.
That's right.
So that really fascinating topic to get into towards the later ends of the podcast.
Sure.
But I should say, for those listening, it's the 14th of February,
Yes.
So Valentine's Day.
Valentine's Day.
I can't help but notice you haven't brought me a gift. Which I'm a little
it's
bit...
coming in the post, don't worry.
Okay, well that's good to know. But yeah, I think if we just begin by giving a little bit of background to how European defence has emerged and developed, particularly towards the latter part of the 90s and then into the 2000s.
Sure. Well, Europe has faced many security threats throughout these years. You know, not mentioning obviously World War I and World War II, we had the Balkan Wars also. So Europe has, as promised after World War II, there will be no more, but we saw what happened in the Balkans. There had been threats from inside Europe, and nations had to come together to fight these things. And I think when it comes time to defense, you know, parties are stronger when there's an external threat abound. And that's when nations come together and they pull together and they work together for these threats to be resolved. And as nations developed, we had some world leaders, i.e. also the UK, the US obviously, France within the European context. And these were the two major powers, the UK and France, that led security cooperation and leadership within the defense structure for the last 50 years or so, I would say. But as the world changes, as world powers become less reliable, I guess you'd say, we need to figure out where we go in our defense structures in the next 50 years. We've planned it for the last 50, and governments need to think long term, especially when it comes time to defense. So this is a very interesting time for Europe, and also for the UK given Brexit.
I think the Balkans is a fascinating moment for European security and defence policy.
That's
because up until then, there's the Cold War, which has been the main threat everyone's preparing for, but not sort of a real crisis that needs to be managed. And the Balkans then pose Europe a real challenge.
Mm-hmm.
NATO's, of course, the operating force to begin with, and we're talking about why Europe goes into being involved. But what I find interesting there is you're right, when there's an adversary, it's much easier to cooperate, to come together. But in peacetime, which is how most European defences are positioned, it's generally peacetime operations. They go back to being completely cylindered national forces for the most part, where then they aren't really engaging in cooperation. There's sometimes training, but it's sort of quite piecemeal. I think, is that one of the biggest challenges Europe actually faces in terms of integrating its defence more? It's at peace, and there's this need, this drive.
That's part of it, I think, but also given the changes of the EU partner, the main EU partner, i.e. being the US in this case, has been pretty consistent in their expectations of the EU and Europe in general, and the expectations of Europe has been quite, unchallenged and unchanged from the US since at least World War II. And given what happened in the Balkans, you're right. I mean, Thatcher was one of the main supporters of peace, obviously within the Balkan context, and we have a situation now where our historical allies have changed their tune, and they're expecting different things from Europe, and Europe perhaps has spent so much time under the shelter of the US are now grappling with what situation they're going to face moving forward. Who are going to be the main leaders in this? How are they going to come together? And in terms of the European Union context, that is sort of a shelter in which countries have come together economically and for trade. But Europe as a body in general now needs to figure out who will be the leader within the European context. And given Brexit and given the UK's independence in terms of their trade policy and their trade relations with Europe, it's going to be a very interesting time to see how we move forward. Europe is at a crossroads right now. They're at I'd consider it perhaps a slight identity crisis in terms of who they are, who they want to be leading them, and as Europe have sort of a balance of powers, Germany, France, and the UK could be seen as the leaders. They're equal in terms of their reputation within the EU, and their power structures are also quite complementary. So once a power like the UK leaves, that turns the power shifts, upside down almost. And we'll see from the smaller NATO nations, perhaps doubt within the structure of what happens if the US takes a back seat.
I think it's loads of fascinating issues to get into with this topic. And you're right, America's role in Europe and how it's in many ways shaped European defence policy is a really big issue. We've also got Britain coming out, how it's been involved, again, with American expectations in developing European defence policy. And what's interesting, I think, when Europe goes in to play a role in the Balkans, superseding NATO in the peacekeeping mission, is there's almost that hope that it will allow American resources to be freed up for more active expeditionary operations. So that's an interesting area. And then Europe in the future going forward, without Britain, one of the major military powers, leaves France as the sort of key military power, but obviously Germany with its big strength. And for Britain, that's interesting because, of course, we're hoping we have the RAF museums, so air power's a big deal here. Tempest for future programme for sixth generation fighter.
That's right.
That's it. The underpinning of it is that European partners will be involved in developing it. And if they're not, it won't happen. So again, there's a real need for Britain, even if it's leaving the European Union, to engage in cooperation.
That's right.
So three big areas to get into.
Big time.
I think if we start with America, because that really is one of the big drivers for European defence.
Yeah.
And I want to, what do you think they really expect from Europe? And how, conversely, is Europe positioning itself to both deal with those expectations and do what it wants to do in terms of its defence policy?
Sure. Well, as you mentioned in your beautiful introduction there, the Europe and the US have been partners fighting against an external enemy, you see? Whether that was sort of the rise of Nazism and Russia in the past. Now we see an America which is more transactional than before. Their long-term view of security have changed now with President Trump coming into office. And President Trump is expecting a lot more in terms of financial contributions to the security of Europe. And I guess if you see it from the US point of view, that's rightfully so. The US spend on average 4% of their GDP on defense, whereas the majority of NATO partners don't even spend the minimum of 2%. The UK does a good job in spending 2%. I think Estonia spends the most out of all European NATO partners, because they have sort of an immediate threat, I guess, of Russia at their doorstep, so they're incentivized to do so. So given that, as I mentioned in the past, their relationship have been set on very solid foundations, when the US comes up and demands and pressures NATO into perhaps even following what their own rules say, countries which in the past would have freeloaded, I guess you'd say, or would have benefited from the protection of the US, now are in a situation where they need to think of, if the US weren't there, or if they changed their relationship with Europe, how would they be able to deal with it? The threats we face these days aren't only from tanks and guns, but the cyber warfare, hybrid warfare is a thing now which unfortunately many sort of smaller NATO countries aren't prepared for, as well as perhaps the Americas and Britain and France are. So that leaves them in a place of insecurity, and when insecurity comes into the fray, doubt comes into the fray, trust is broken, and a sense of animosity comes into it too, because they're unsure of how this plays out in the future. Since they're not the leaders in it, they need to have leadership presented, and then they'll come to a decision as to what to do next.
Yeah, I think for the American side of it now, with Trump as the president, the difficulty is expectations.
Yeah.
It's difficult to know what America will do next. And it's not had a consistent policy all the way through. which makes, of course, very difficult to plan if you're a European partner, what your role to support or to benefit as well from America's policy will be.
That's right.
The spending per soldier is, particularly if you look at Eastern European, remarkably low compared to the Americans. Of course, we mentioned 4% as their headline figure. Of course, the benefit for them is they get to support domestic industries, which for a lot of European nations isn't the case. So there's challenges there. I think if we look at the Cold War technology, which is still left over, these nations have huge amounts of what seem like resources, but actually, unless you spend the money to upgrade them, they're almost sort of antiquated technology.
That's right.
Which is remarkable. And cyber's a real key part there, isn't it? And how do you feel Europe is positioned to deal with the emerging cyber threat, particularly those countries in Eastern European?
Yeah. Well, the countries in Eastern Europe have their own problems. I think it's sort of, if you think of it as Maslow's hierarchy of needs of a human being, you need your basics, your food, your shelter, your sleep, to begin with as a human being. Then you progress throughout the stages, and you get to a sense of understanding philosophy. So that is, certain nations within Eastern Europe have domestic problems, and integrating themselves into NATO is probably the last thing on their minds. Coming from an Eastern European country myself, I know that poverty is a big thing. Corruption is a big topic that they need to sort out. Developing their economies is at their forefront, and when it comes time to security threats, they are very much unprepared, I think, for the 21st century line of threats that are coming out, because the innovators in this space are the world leaders in trade, in finance, in defense, and they are sort of the Security Council main five, I guess you'd call them, with innovations coming out of Israel and other nations as well. So they are really much reliant on their more established, bigger NATO partners to lead in these areas. But for sure, these are things that are coming up which are new, and anything that is new, it takes time to understand, and you need also financial investment into this. And if investment in general is going down in defense, as is with the UK because of many different factors, US spending on European security is also on the decline, which means they need to first of all have the money to invest, and also have a structure in seeing what are the main threats, how do we solve them, where does the money go, and what expertise do we need. Security comes from having the money, the resources, the expertise, and the willpower and the political will to make decisions happen. If one of these aren't in sync, then progress is a lot slower, which means security is compromised.
So I think there's two issues which come from here, and I think we'll circle back round to some of the other issues which came up against, which is, first of all, is cooperation in security and cyber one of the key areas where Europe leading to join up cooperation across Europe can actually have a really positive impact. And when it comes down to it, is it a question of money? And does European cooperation actually mask the decline of military capabilities? So if we think about Britain, for instance, the last defence review, every pound spent on cyber was a pound that had to be removed from conventional capabilities. So does European cooperation actually mask that decline rather than anything else?
Well, European cooperation is there's no how can I say, for European cooperation, it's such a big concept to even think about, because there's so many things that go into European cooperation. It also depends on the leaderships of the countries at that time. They have different points of view on what should be done. So every 4 years or so, we see a pivot in what nations think they should contribute and what they believe other nations should contribute to collective security. But the idea of having a collective... these days, we see nations breaking away and having their own points of view and their own leadership styles in what they think is necessary. Given the example perhaps of nations which were smaller in terms of their economic progress and now are much larger, we see a case where, because nations have developed economically, they no longer need to rely perhaps on the leadership of other nations, and they have a larger voice because they are growing economically as nations, their capabilities are growing, and they're more aware of global threats, because the way the world is shaping, it's a lot more globalized, so they need to be much more aware of it. So Europe has a big challenge bringing together 27, not 28 anymore, unfortunately, 27 nations and having an aligned strategy. That's a lot more difficult now with all these challenges coming to be, and hopefully they do find some sort of way forward. But security, in terms of cyber capability, is so key, because it has the ability to destabilize not only the security of a nation, but the economics of a nation and so many other parts that keep a nation alive and prosperous.
It's interesting as well that this is a really important area of cooperation, and one where there's a lot of public support for it. And most of the time, benign capabilities such as operations in cyber and security do seem to have a lot of public support saying European cooperation is a good thing. Which, if you then contrast it, when you ask people about, do you think Europe should cooperate more in defence, there's the scare story of the super army, the European super army, particularly in Britain.
Sure.
And that often distracts us from the fact that a lot of cooperation has occurred in the realm of defence. And Britain in particular has been a big player in that. So if we look at when the Labour government emerged in 97 into 98, and the agreements they reached with France, which then became part of the Europeans' defence policy, I think we look at how did Britain shape defence policy? How did these trends emerge? And was it a case of trying to work alongside NATO structures and capabilities? Same sort of time there was a wish to Europeanise the decision-making chain of command in NATO, but with the emergence of a European defence policy, that no longer became a priority. So I just wonder, how has Britain really played a role in that?
Britain's played a key role historically in defence and in security. You know, they were an empire once upon a time, as was France, and even now they have a large voice because of their capability, because of their knowledge, because of their expertise and their global experience in dealing with different security threats around the world. They have the pedigree to really deal with these threats. But one nation can't go it alone. With threats being so global and so complex, you need cooperation. And what better cooperation than having it with your neighbours, which are there with you, which share similar security concerns, which have a similar outlook on what should be done. But as the sea of geopolitics changes, with Brexit coming into the fray, you know, everything comes from political will. And if nations agree with each other, things can get done. But as nations in Europe tend to now, from my point of view, have a much more independent voice in what they believe should be done for their own security and collective security, that homogenization is no longer as strong as it was once before. And that may see cracks in their security and in their communication and cooperation. Because for things together, you need to communicate, you need to have a shared, agreed plan of what should be done. But then when we have someone like President Macron say, having inklings of needing a European army because we cannot no longer solely rely on our US allies, that rings alarm bells in certain people's minds. And but then that comment was not retracted, but you know, he went underground with that comment after a while because politically it wasn't so sensible to say so, I guess. But it's a mixture between political will, what the people think need to be done, to budget constraints, allocations, skills and expertise, and where they think the security threats lie. You know, for some nations who don't have much experience in perhaps certain areas of defense, they may not think it's important, whereas others think it is important. But aligning on such complex and such diverse issues is going to be a challenge. So they need to have some sort of way in which, even as the UK becomes more independent, they still need to have cooperation in these areas because it's so key for the survival and the prosperity of their neighbours and for themselves too.
I think it's fascinating when you actually look at the amount of cooperation that Britain's engaged in
100%.
with European defence. I mean, at the moment, supporting French operations in Mali logistically. They've got bilateral agreements with France. In the Netherlands, for instance, we've got the Anglo-Netherlands Amphibious Corporation, the Dutch Marines, great relations with the Royal Marines. And, of course, operating in terms of trade and defence, we've talked about Tempest, but then Eurofighter, before then Tornado. So real drivers of cooperation.
For sure.
In terms, there is a national interest there.
For sure.
Of course, in each case, you're protecting parts of your technological base.
Yeah.
So really interesting to see how Britain has used European cooperation to try and enhance its capabilities.
That's right.
And again, I think looking to the future, it's positioned between America and Europe. And what do you feel Britain's priorities are likely to be? You know, the next is a big question here. You know, if we look sort of ahead in 10 years' time, do you think it's going to try to position itself to work with NATO more, to reboot the sort of Western European Union, or move much more towards America's sort of foreign policy, looking to support their expeditionary capabilities?
That's a really big question, and I'll try to take as much bites out of it as possible. But going back to your point of collective security and Britain's role, only recently I think it was It was Italy, the UK, France, and the US signed an MOU for outer space security and in boosting their satellite capabilities for outer space defense. So that's another example, and we'll get into outer space, I'm sure, soon, where we see collective cooperation. But sorry, can you remind me of the question once more because it slipped off?
Well, I think a question wasn't quite accurate,
Yeah.
but many questions.
So you mean so it was
around
Europe's the UK's position now in between Europe and the States.
Yeah.
That's a big question again. I think we haven't heard much from the UK in terms of their defence ambitions. Brexit has sort of taken the fray in these last 3 years, and it's mostly been focused on the more economic side, the immigration side of how the UK deals with these challenges as they leave the EU. So defence, unfortunately, wasn't sort of top of the agenda when it came time to structuring the UK's position post-Brexit. But that needs to be a conversation that needs to be had within Whitehall, within number 10 Downing Street. And I'm sure conversations are happening behind the scene, but that hasn't really been, from what I've seen in the media and also from what I've read, a main priority right now for the UK and how they position themselves. Because there are things right now that they need to solve. They're into the future relationship with the EU, and their focus right now, from what I see in terms of their relationship with the US and the EU, are more financial. So the US President Trump rather has promoted his stance being pro the UK leaving and having an independent voice. So they're aligned in that sense. But what happens next, I think, is really up to what the UK decide to do, and they have the ability to really structure their defence capabilities in the future. No doubt you need cooperation with both partners. It's not an either-or decision. If they plan it in which they can have support from both sides, then that's great. But the EU, I think, also feels some sort of animosity towards the US because they have been quite harsh and quite unpredictable in their dealings with the EU, which may cause the EU to be less willing to cooperate in defence situations with the US, and the UK being the in-between partners. I think they're a keystone, they're cornerstone, they're sort of kingmakers in what happens moving forward with the EU, with the UK, and with the US. But that partnership needs to be maintained, I think, because they share collective security ambitions.
If we just look at space now, because it's an area where you've done a lot of work and a real fascinating topic. And in particular, one area where European defence did come up in the Brexit debate in Britain was to do with the Galileo programme. And here we see a space capability which Europe has developed because it no longer feels it can rely on those assets of other nations.
Well, the European Space Agency is a key driver in Europe's responses to outer space threats, right? And it's a key part of our new defence challenges. And I actually have given a workshop to members of the defence community. If you were a few months ago, or actually it was last year rather now, it was a round table. It was a deep dive sort of workshop on understanding space capabilities, and around that round table we had US representatives from defence, we had the RAF, in fact, we had the Canadian Air Force, we had the Romanian MOD, and some private companies too. But I don't think it's fair to say that that because of these changing political structures, this will take a long time to translate into defence changes too, because a nation's defence outlook is a lot more long-term as opposed to short-term political ambitions, you see. So we will see, I think, a continued cooperation in these matters because it's so necessary for the collective security of each, and it will be very counterintuitive and counterproductive to now, because of Brexit, for example, to divide and to separate collaboration. As you mentioned, the UK has been key in Europe's security, as has France, as has other players. So they've had a history of working together. They know how each other think. They know how they work well together. And it's key to keep these alliances going because threats coming from the outside are also developing at very rapid rates. And as technology becomes a lot more accessible, a lot cheaper, we will see bigger threats coming up. And if we're not secure in our relationships with our neighbours, then it will leave us in a very weak position because there's only so much one nation can do with global threats. You need collaboration and cooperation to meet these security threats in the future. And also going back to the point you mentioned before, Europe's security threats are not different to UK security threats. We have, counter-terrorism operations, which we're working very closely with. We have migration patterns from North Africa and from the Middle East, which needs a collective response to. Organised crime is something that we need a collective response to, and it's no point now for us to say, because of Brexit, we can't work together in these spaces. Defence is something which is so crucial in nation building, that we need to have some sort of common ideas and common standards and common cooperation to deal with these threats moving forward, whether it's outer space, whether it's more domestic challenges, whether it's international challenges. Communication and cooperation is key no matter what stage you are in any political process.
Yeah, and I think if we just look at the military conflicts which have happened, I think the last one that involved one nation fighting from within Europe, possibly globally here, we're talking the Falklands War.
Yeah.
And since then, every other conflict has been a multi-partner operation.
Yeah. But even with the Falklands War, we saw a few days ago on the BBC a report from the Washington Post, I think, or the Washington Journal, an American publication, saying that the US shared intelligence with the UK in helping with the Falklands War. So any kind of military conquest, there is cooperation and collaboration, especially with the UK and the US. And for a country to go it alone in terms of its defense, it's like walking into the jungle, holding a spear, when you have so many bigger threats and bigger problems that one spear can't already solve.
And I think if we talk about air power in particular, for Europe, it's one of the big areas where any capability in terms of conflict, you have to bring in air power.
For sure.
Space is an emerging issue as well.
Yeah.
And those are two areas where Britain's been very, very key in developing capabilities.
That's right.
And because it's a major power, it has these high-level capabilities which a lot of other nations can't afford.
Yeah.
What becomes interesting is when you're then faced with conflicts such as in Ukraine, where you might not want to resort to conventional capabilities. How is it you can then deal with these situations where also you can't necessarily rely on the partner you always thought you could?
Yeah. This is a really interesting, and I love talking about these problems because, as I mentioned before, hybrid warfare is a type of warfare that relies partly on conventional means, but also other means to get a nation's agenda completed. And we have, historically, the UK has, an incredible history of using conventional means. The RAF, for example, one of the most, if not the most powerful air forces in the world in dealing with threats externally. These conventional warfare weapons now can't really be used in such unconventional means, and we need to develop other responses to these threats. But I think the intelligence and the way that the UK have developed their thinking on international defence, they've had a long experience in doing so, but that needs to continue to evolve and adapt to new changes and challenges, because you can't use a fighter jet to beat cyber warfare. That just doesn't work. And the threats have changed now, and we see the UK investing a lot of money into these capabilities. And a nation needs to develop new weapons and new defences for the common day, for these modern day problems. You can't go into war with a bayonet on the end of your gun anymore. You have different capabilities. So we can use the learnings we've had in the past and apply them to into these new situations, because if we stay with our old solutions to new problems, that's never going to work. And if we continue to have a mentality of, we need to try to fit a square piece into a round hole, that's just not going to work, and we're going to face even more growing threats from external powers. That will be a big challenge if we don't deal with these problems now.
I think what's interesting for this point as well is that we always picture greater cooperation being driven from the top.
Yeah.
Political leaders coming together and saying, let's do more.
Yeah.
It's part of a sort of concerted strategy.
Yeah.
Often it seems to be that it's the actors below that level operating together, and then the political process almost formalises the cooperation which has already begun to happen. And with Britain leaving the European Union, how do you feel that is likely to move forward? Will the armed forces, the security agencies still be able to engage in this cooperation which leads to better cooperation in terms of the threats we see in Eastern Europe?
Yeah.
Or will it be almost hindered by this not quite arbitrary war which comes down? How would you like to see that happen?
I don't think the UK really knows the answer to that question themselves right now. They're really stuck in a crossroads, and we see this with so many different nations, not only defence. How do we structure our position to the world now? We've made a decision to leave a bloc which we've developed such a close relationship with, and we're so interconnected with. Now, as we start to unwind the threads. We're left trying to rewind them into something new. And how that happens is there's so many ways in which we can approach that. But it depends on the political will and where the politicians see this going, the lawmakers see this going. Because no matter what it is, leadership comes from the top and is enacted on the lower rungs. You get information and intelligence comes from the lower rungs, but essentially it comes from the top. And we also see a growth in private companies in suggesting and also innovating in terms of weapons defenses. Before you may have seen the MOD developing capabilities, but now we see new not even new players but private players seeing what the market has on offer and seeing what defense agencies need to develop stronger, more malleable defense capabilities. But the UK is in such a crossroads now that it can go in any way. We, for example, see Europol as an example of this. The UK is obviously a big contributor to Europol, and they work together very closely with their European partners. We may need to leave Europol now, which leaves us sort of blindsided and leaves us in a situation where we need to develop similar capabilities, or we don't develop capabilities at all because we're no longer part of that pact. So the UK is in such a position now where they need to really figure out what they want to do and how they want to move it forward. In my opinion, I think the closer collaboration, the better, because you need that. But whether or not the politicians believe that's possible, given the direction of Brexit now, leaves the UK potentially and leaves a big gap in their security structures because they don't have cooperation, or they may not have cooperation from their European partners as much as they did in the past.
I think we have to hope that cooperation, particularly in security,
100%.
will continue, because if not, it's a negative-sum game. Both sides would lose.
Exactly.
But I think what's interesting there is to go back on your point about the privatisation of security and defence, because historically, defence has been the provenance of the state.
Yeah.
That is what defined the state, its ability to defend its citizens.
That's right.
But in both the Europeanisation of defence, we see those capabilities being moved up to the supernatural level.
That's right.
I might have said supernatural rather than supra.
Yeah.
Supranatural level, and also moving downwards to private companies.
Yeah.
And there's this real split away from what the state used to hold as its own preserve of the ability to use force.
Yeah.
And cyber, of course, it's a new use of force, but it is exerting force.
That's right.
And with Britain talking about taking back control, about state sovereignty, how does defence fit into that? Because it's not discussed at all. You're right, in Brexit, defence very rarely came up because people no longer perceive it as being the most important issue. But historically, that has been what defines states' control.
100%.
So how does that now come in with private companies as well?
You need a strong security and defence architecture to then develop industry, then to develop other liberal everything else. Essentially, everything comes from a secure nation. If you don't have a secure nation, then anything you build on top of that, there's a big risk of it crumbling. And you're right in saying that with the private sector having a bigger impact, with also defense capabilities becoming more democratized, it becoming a lot cheaper, to build and to threaten nations with and companies with. There's a big blurry line now, and also I think the main part of it is private industry can do things a lot cheaper, and they can move a lot quicker. They don't have the bureaucracy that we have in Whitehall, for example, to deal with. So we will see a continued collaboration between the private sector and the public sector in this, and that needs to be the case, because no longer can we rely on governments to have a horizon scan of what the future threats will be. We need other players on the ground that can do so. That comes also from having a strong education system which helps students in the defence field, students of defence and security, have a much bigger appreciation and a knowledge base of the varying security threats we have on offer, I guess you can call it, in this brave new world, and responding to it accordingly. No longer can you rely only the government or the state structure to keep you safe, because we have non-state actors which are a lot faster, which move at different speeds, which can attack you in different ways. And if you don't have that collaboration or that knowledge share, then you're left with only half of the picture, and half the picture leads to a weaker response to these growing defence issues.
Yeah, I think it's a really fascinating topic, and the issue for Europe as a whole is what direction now
Yeah.
does it travel in,
Yeah.
with Britain having left?
That's right.
And how does it bind the 27 states with a force capability,
Yeah.
at the same level as the Americans,
Sure.
but because they all have individual headquarters, individual backroom stuff, how does it bind all of this together to actually take on more roles so that when crises do emerge, in its near neighbours, and Ukraine, as you say, is a great example, how is it actually going to position itself to be able to respond independently?
You need, I think, with the UK leaving, I think the EU, for example, we'll stick to this point. The EU need to show quick leadership. It's like when you rip a band-aid off, or when you rip a scab off, it starts to bleed. You need something there to keep it to keep the blood in the body, or to make sure the wound doesn't get even worse. And for the EU, this may be seen as a defense wound, because we have one of the biggest defense players in the EU now taking a different, more independent path, which leaves smaller players within the EU again thinking of what are the next steps. Hopefully, bigger players within the European defense structure can now take leadership in this and use this as a way to shape what they believe the EU's response to these growing threats will be. But for sure, the UK, with this independent voice that it has now, has great potential in developing a point of view on defense and the foreign policy, which perhaps in the past was more constricted because of their EU partners, now having a more independent voice and a more freer voice in doing what it feels it needs to do to keep the UK safe, and I wouldn't say the world safe, because that sort of used to be the US's job. Right now is in question, but to keep what they believe the structure of their interests, to keep it in line. And it's a big question mark now, because the UK, as you mentioned, have been focusing mostly on their economic relations with the EU, and defense needs to play a bigger role in that. But where we go next is a big question mark. But I hope they take a sensible and secure route as opposed to a weak and wobbly route.
That's a really nice point to start wrapping up on, I think, because one of the areas which I think we haven't talked on, and we could perhaps end on, is how we integrate the European defence side of it, America and Britain, within NATO. And of course, Trump is not the biggest fan of NATO. Certainly feels nations should be spending more, sometimes fairly, sometimes unfairly. But how, and again we took Macron's position about NATO has become more ambiguous. How does Europe use NATO to further its own ends here?
I think mentioning France, because it's sort of this, as you mentioned, France and the UK have been leading in this. I think this, what I've seen from Macron recently, since this Brexit talk has come up, he's been a lot more opportunistic. He's voiced his opinion more so, and he's shown perhaps more leadership in what he believes the EU, the route the EU should take. And naturally, I think he believes that as the UK leaves, perhaps the crown of responsibility now lies on France to show leadership in terms of defence, along with Germany and other more established EU and more powerful EU nations. But I think we will wait and see. I think is the answer here. It's not in my hands as to what the EU do. It's up to the leadership to decide what they want to have achieved, what they want to achieve in this new phase of EU, UK, US relations. There needs to be some sort of acronym. I think we need to devise between these three players, which we don't have now. But for sure, the US is seeing the world. They're a lot more. I don't know how can I say. They're probably a lot more pragmatic in their approaches. The US has expressed many times their ambitions not to engage in any more wars, to pull out of any existing wars and any existing conflicts. This may seem counterintuitive given what's happening with Iran now, but then that perhaps shows his opportunistic nature as well when they assassinate General Soleimani of Iran. But again, we can't look at the world without looking at the world isn't only the US, UK, and Europe. We have other bigger players in the world in which nations can collaborate with and can really form specific defense capabilities with. So you don't need to always think of we need to keep the UK and the US and Europe together. There's many other options on the table, because other smaller players, let's say from the Middle East, have a lot more experience in dealing with that area, so you should be able to see where you go is dependent on your agenda. So if the UK now leaving the EU want to engage with other players, they perhaps have the ability to do so, as opposed to when they were part of the EU.
I think France is going to have a bigger voice now. It's the main defence player in the Union.
100%.
And again, it'll be interesting to see how Britain and France choose to interact together. If they go for more bilateral agreements where they share knowledge. I happen to think that's the most likely route, and that France and Britain before have been very good at sharing capabilities because they have the same sort of levels of defence and about sharing military knowledge. And before, they probably haven't taken a more active route in that direction because it quite alienated a lot of the other European partners. And there's a sense that they're being elitist, which you never like to be accused of. You always want to take other people with you as well.
Sure.
But if you think we are both nuclear powers, they both have aircraft carriers where no other nation has these capabilities. I think how the rest of Europe and Britain comes together in defence is an unknown picture, but that Britain and France stay quite close together, I think is a given. But one thing we should wrap up on, and I've softened you up by telling you we were going to finish, is to ask you about China. And of course, so it's difficult really to mention the whole geopolitical situation without going on to China.
100%.
And whilst they don't often come into direct contact in terms of theatres of interest, there certainly is the need to talk about how Europe copes with the emerged threat of China, but also works with it in terms of developing capabilities, sharing knowledge where it's appropriate. I mean, what's your sense about how Europe should treat China?
That's a big question. I don't know how you want me to answer that in the next 2 minutes, but I'll try my best. China has been, it's always been an emerging power, but I think we've seen it thoroughly emerge now with their, for sure their technological capabilities. And there is a sense, I believe, of suspicion in terms of working together defense-wise with China. We've never really done it before. We don't really know what their thinking is on this. We've typically stayed within our own neighborhoods. The closer you stay with your neighbors, the more you understand, there's a better chance of working together with physically closer partners. And China has always represented sort of an external threat in terms of its defense. We've never really cooperated too much with them in anything to do with defense in the past. In fact, we've perhaps seen them more as an adversary than as an ally, given its history as well, and the history between these blocs. So as we move forward, a big flashpoint is obviously Huawei and its integration into the UK tech and telecommunications infrastructure, which the US is very much against. I think because the US has experience in their own capabilities, and they know what they are capable of. And they know that China are developing very similar, if not better, capabilities, faster capabilities. So they know what these technologies can be used for. And it perhaps goes back to the old Thucydides trap: when a rising power goes to war with a declining power, that's where the friction comes into it. But the role of China in world defense is a big one because they are physically so large and they have the capabilities to do a lot. They haven't really been a traditional, they haven't really developed traditional capabilities. They never really had to in the past. They've remained quite internal in terms of their growth. They've never been expansionist as a power. The EU and Europe in general has been expansionist in its ambitions. Physically, we've seen throughout history, and China now has to have the capabilities and the long-term political stability to really develop long-term defense strategy, because they don't have democracy, I guess, and they can do so. So that leads them into a position where they don't need to chop and change as much as other partners do, other countries do. But the US for sure is the US-China relationship is more of a frenemy relationship. They work together with trade because they need to keep the global economy going, but on things as national security and defense, they remain quite separated. And we see this playing out in today, and President Trump makes no qualms about it. He lets the world know that we will work together with you for trade and defense, but when it comes time to your technological capability, your defense capability, we're keeping an eye on you. And I'm sure the Chinese are keeping an eye on the US as well. And they are a big player for sure, and they need to be they need to be understood. Their ambitions need to be understood, and you work together as and when required. There's no push, there's no need to develop joint military planning with them, because the threats aren't going in that direction, or the capability. If you don't need to do it, you don't really have to do it, but you need to keep an eye on what this major power is doing, how they see the world, and respond accordingly.
Yeah, I think with all of these things, the real driver for change is often conflict, and I don't think it will be a bad thing if there isn't a necessity to further these capabilities because Europe stays at peace.
Yeah.
So I think that's a nice point to end on. Thank you
so.
very much for coming
Thank you
in.
so much.
Are there any social media sites or websites you want to point people towards?
Well, for me, I'm KlismanMurati.com is my sort of personal website. PangeoWire.com is my company website. I'm on LinkedIn quite often, so you can find me on LinkedIn, on Twitter as well. Just type in Klisman Murati. I'm on all sorts of platforms. If you just put in my name
across
into Google,
the social media.
I've got some documents on Google Scholar on sort of defense articles I've written and political economy of energy policy articles I've written. So I'm out there. Just put in my name and you'll find a bunch of things.
Fantastic. And you're giving a lecture for the Royal Air Force Museum.
I am.
At the Royal Air and
Very soon. That's right.
Excellent. So yes, we'll share details of that as well.
Thank you so much.
Well, thank you very much for coming in, Klisman.
Thank you so much, Harry.